In 1894, the obituary of Lady Evelyn Caldwell was printed in every major London newspaper. A carriage accident on a stormy cliffside road. A closed casket. A grieving duke who locked himself in his estate for a year, haunted by the memory of the woman he loved and betrayed. But 5 years later, while inspecting a textile mill in the grimy outskirts of Manchester, the Duke of Ashford saw a pair of hands he would know anywhere stitching lace. He froze. Because the woman buried in his family crypt was standing right in front of him. And she wasn't alone. The noise of the Manchester textile district was a physical assault. It wasn't just the clattering of the looms or the hissing of steam engines. It was the shouting of foremen, the weeping of exhausted children, and the relentless grinding hum of industry. For Adrian Penhaligon, the 9th Duke of Ashford, this was hell. But it was a necessary hell. His family's fortune, drained by his late father's gambling debts, relied heavily on these investments. Adrian adjusted his cravat, trying to ignore the soot settling on his pristine wool coat. He was a man of 32, though his eyes looked 50. Dark circles permanently shadowed his sharp, aristocratic features, the lingering scars of grief and insomnia. "As you can see, Your Grace," Mr. Thaddeus Moore, the mill manager, shouted over the din. "Productivity is up 20% since we installed the new mechanical looms. We run a tight ship. No idleness here." Adrian nodded absently, his gaze sweeping over the rows of women bent over their work. They were faceless to him, merely cogs in the machine that kept his estate, Blackwood Hall, from crumbling. He hated that he had become this man, cold, detached, driven only by duty. "And this section," Moore continued, gesturing to a quieter corner where the finer work was done, "is for the detailed embroidery and lace repair. We take the damaged goods and make them sellable." Adrian stepped closer. The light was better here, filtering through grime-streaked windows. A woman sat at the end of the bench, her back to him. Her posture was different from the others. While the other women hunched, defeat evident in their spines, this woman sat with a rigid, practiced grace. Her hair was covered by a rough linen cap, but a single tendril of dark chestnut hair had escaped, curling against the nape of her neck. Adrian's heart hammered a strange, erratic rhythm. It couldn't be. He had buried that shade of chestnut hair 5 years ago. He had touched it as it lay cold and lifeless in a coffin, or so he had been told. The casket had been closed due to the severity of the carriage accident. "You there!" Moore barked, noticing the Duke's lingering stare, and assuming he found fault. "Pick up the pace! The Duke hasn't got all day to watch you dawdle." The woman stiffened. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, she turned her head. Time didn't just stop for Adrian. It shattered. The face was thinner, sharper, the cheeks were hollowed by hunger and hardship, and the skin was pale and devoid of the expensive creams she used to favor. But the eyes, those violet blue eyes that had once looked at him with adoration and then with shattering betrayal, were unmistakable. It was Evelyn, his wife, the Duchess of Ashford, the woman whose headstone he visited every Sunday. She looked at him, and for a second, the mask of the weary seamstress slipped. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed across her face. Then, just as quickly, she dropped her gaze, her fingers trembling as they clutched the needle. "Evelyn?" Adrian whispered. The sound was lost in the noise of the factory, but he felt the vibration of the name in his chest. Moore looked confused. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, that's just Mary. She's one of our quiet ones. Keeps to herself. A widow, I believe." "Mary," Adrian repeated, his voice gaining strength, turning into a growl. He stepped forward, ignoring the grime on the floor. "Mary, look at me." The woman didn't look up. She was sewing faster now, the needle flashing dangerously close to her fingers. "I have a quota, sir," she said. Her voice was rougher, deeper than he remembered, affected by the smoke and the damp air of the north. But the cadence was hers. Adrian reached out and grabbed her wrist. The contact sent a shock through him. Her skin was rough, calloused, not the soft silk of the debutante he had married. "Adrian, don't," she hissed, finally looking up. The mill manager gasped. The other women stopped working, staring in shock. A seamstress did not address a duke by his Christian name. "It is you," Adrian breathed, his grip tightening. "You're dead. I buried you." "The Duchess is dead," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but her chin high. "She died on the cliffs of Dover. I am Mary. Please, your grace, let me go. You caused enough damage 5 years ago." "I caused damage?" Adrian looked as if he'd been slapped. "You let me mourn you. You let me believe. I let you be free," she snapped, pulling her wrist back. She stood up, gathering her meager shawl. "I let you go back to her. Isn't that what you wanted? Now, if you'll excuse me, my shift is over." "Her?" Adrian was reeling. "Who are you talking about? Evelyn, wait!" But she was already moving, weaving through the crowded looms with a speed born of desperation. Adrian tried to follow, but Moore stepped in his way, flustered. "Your Grace, surely you are mistaken. The fumes in here. Get out of my way," Adrian roared, shoving the man aside. He burst out of the mill doors into the gray, drizzling afternoon. The street was crowded with workers changing shifts. He scanned the sea of flat caps and shawls, frantic. He saw the flash of that chestnut hair disappearing down a narrow alleyway known as Spinner's Row. He ran. He didn't care about dignity. He didn't care that his boots were splashing through puddles of muck. He turned the corner just in time to see her opening the door to a dilapidated tenement building. "Evelyn!" he shouted. She slammed the door shut. Adrian reached the door and pounded on it. It was locked. He leaned his forehead against the damp wood, breathing heavily. He wasn't leaving. He would buy this entire building and tear it down brick by brick if he had to. He had found a ghost, and this time he wasn't going to let the mystery bury itself. Inside the small, drafty room, Evelyn leaned against the door, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "Mama?" A small, sleepy voice came from the corner of the room. Evelyn's head snapped up. Sitting up on the lumpy straw mattress, rubbing sleep from his eyes, was a boy. He was small for his age, with messy dark hair and an inquisitive expression, but it was his eyes that mattered. They were dark, intense, and shaped exactly like the man currently pounding on the door. "Leo," Evelyn whispered, scrambling over to hug him fiercely. "It's okay, darling. Mama is here." "Who is knocking?" Leo asked, clutching his ragged stuffed bear. "A monster," Evelyn said, tears finally spilling over. "A monster from a story I thought ended a long time ago." Adrian didn't leave. He stood in the rain for 2 hours, his expensive coat soaked through, his valet standing awkwardly by the carriage at the end of the alleyway. Finally, the door creaked open. It wasn't Evelyn. It was an older woman, her face a map of wrinkles, holding a bucket of slop. She eyed Adrian with suspicion. "She says if you don't go away, she's calling the constable," the old woman croaked. "Let her call him," Adrian said, his voice steel. "I am the magistrate of this county. I own the land the constable's station is built on. Tell her I am not leaving until we speak." The old woman grunted and retreated. 5 minutes later, the door opened again. This time, it was Evelyn. She had removed her cap, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders, thinner than before, but still beautiful. She wore a faded gray dress that had been patched a dozen times. 5 minutes, she said coldly. "Then you leave us alone forever." "Us?" Adrian asked, stepping into the dark hallway. The smell of cabbage and damp mold hit him instantly. "Who is us, Evelyn?" She didn't answer. She turned and led him up a narrow, creaking staircase to the second floor. The room she entered was tiny. A single window, cracked and stuffed with rags, let in the dim light. There was a small stove, a table with one chair, and a mattress in the corner. And on the mattress sat a boy. Adrian froze in the doorway. The world tilted on its axis. The boy looked up. He had Adrian's chin. He had Adrian's brow. He even had the peculiar way Adrian held his head when he was studying something, slightly tilted to the left. "My God," Adrian whispered. He looked from the boy to Evelyn. "Evelyn, how old is he?" "He turned 5 last month," she said, standing protectively between the Duke and the child. 5. Adrian did the math. The accident was 5 years and 3 months ago. "You were pregnant. When you left, when you died, you were with child." "I didn't know until after I ran," she said, her voice hard. "Not until I was in the safe house in Dover. By then it was too late to turn back. Not that I would have." Adrian took a step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out toward the boy. "He is my son. That is the heir to the Ashford dukedom living in squalor. He is my son," Evelyn corrected sharply. "His name is Leo. And he is happy. He is loved. He doesn't know what it's like to be ignored by a father who prefers the company of opera singers and gambling halls." The accusation hit its mark. Adrian flinched. "Is that what you think happened?" Adrian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that why you faked your death? Because of gossip?" "Gossip?" Evelyn let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "I saw you, Adrian. I came to your study that night, the night before the trip to Dover. I wanted to tell you I suspected I was carrying. And I found you with her. Lady Claire Vance, wrapped in your arms." Adrian stared at her, genuinely confused. "Claire?" "Evelyn. Claire Vance is my cousin. My first cousin. She was sobbing on my shoulder because her husband had beaten her black and blue. I was comforting a family member." Evelyn faltered. The conviction that had fueled her rage for 5 years flickered. No, I heard you say you loved her. You said, 'I love you and I will fix this.'" "I love her as a sister," Adrian shouted, the frustration boiling over. "And I was fixing her marriage settlement so she could leave him. Evelyn, you ran away. You staged a carriage accident. You put me through 5 years of hell. Because of a misunderstanding?" "It wasn't just that," Evelyn cried, tears springing to her eyes. "You were distant. You were cold. You spent every night at the club. I felt like a broodmare you'd bought and forgotten about. I thought if I disappeared, you'd be relieved. You could marry someone you actually wanted." The silence that followed was heavy. The boy Leo watched them with wide, frightened eyes. Adrian looked at his wife, his living, breathing, suffering wife, and his son. The anger drained out of him, replaced by an overwhelming sorrow. He looked around the room. The peeling wallpaper, the single crust of bread on the table, the thin blanket on the bed. "I was distant," Adrian admitted, his voice cracking, "because we were losing everything. My father left us destitute. I was at the club gambling not for pleasure, but trying to win back enough money to keep the roof over Blackwood Hall. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry. I wanted to protect you." Evelyn stared at him. We were poor?" "We were ruined," Adrian said. "I spent the last 5 years rebuilding the fortune, alone, thinking the only light in my life was dead at the bottom of a cliff." He fell to his knees. It was a shocking sight. A duke, kneeling on a dirty floorboards in a Manchester slum. He looked at Leo. "Hello, Leo," Adrian said softly. Leo looked at his mother for permission. Evelyn hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. "Hello," Leo whispered. I'm your father." Leo frowned. "Mama said my father was a star in the sky." "I was," Adrian said, tears streaming down his face. "But I fell down. And I've been looking for you." Adrian looked up at Evelyn. "I am not leaving without you. Both of you." "I can't go back, Adrian," Evelyn said, shaking her head. "I'm legally dead. The scandal, it would ruin you all over again. And Leo, he's illegitimate in the eyes of the law if I'm dead. Then we will resurrect you," Adrian vowed, standing up. I don't care about the scandal. I don't care about the law. I am the Duke of Ashford, and I am taking my family home." But as he reached for her, a heavy pounding echoed on the downstairs door again. This time, it wasn't a polite knock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a cane. Evelyn's face went white. "Oh no! Who is it?" Adrian demanded, his hand moving to the small pistol he kept in his coat pocket. "It's not the law," Evelyn whispered. "It's the creditor, Mr. Silas Grimsby, the man who owns the mill and this building. I owe him for Leo's medicine when he had pneumonia last winter. He says if I don't pay by tonight, he's taking Leo to the workhouse." Adrian's expression shifted. The sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying rage that belonged to the aristocracy of old. "He wants to take my son?" Adrian adjusted his cuffs. "Open the door, Evelyn. I believe I would like to have a word with Mr. Grimsby." The knocking on the door turned into a kick. The wood splintered near the lock. "Open up, Mary!" a voice bellowed from the hallway. It was a voice like grinding stones, crude, arrogant, and loud. "I know you're in there. I heard that brat of yours crying. If you don't have my £3, I'm taking the boy as collateral. The orphanage pays a finder's fee for healthy lads, you know." Evelyn trembled, instinctively stepping back toward the corner where Leo was huddled. But Adrian didn't tremble. He stood in the center of the room, smoothing the wet lapels of his coat. He looked out of place, a diamond in a coal chute, but his eyes were dark with a violence that fit the setting perfectly. "Open it," Adrian commanded softly. Evelyn hesitated, then undid the latch. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a crack. Silas Grimsby filled the frame. He was a large man, his belly straining against a grease-stained waistcoat, clutching a silver-tipped cane like a weapon. He smelled of cheap gin and unwashed wool. "About time," Grimsby sneered, stepping inside without looking around. "Now, where is the money, or do I grab the—" He stopped. He had finally noticed the tall, imposing figure standing in the shadows of the unlit room. Adrian stepped into the sliver of light from the window. He towered over Grimsby, not in width, but in sheer, suffocating presence. "Who are you?" Grimsby demanded, though his voice wavered slightly. "One of her customers?" "I didn't know you were whoring yourself out, Mary, though I expected it eventually." The sound of the slap was shocking in its volume. Adrian didn't use a fist. He used the back of his hand, a disdainful, aristocratic strike that sent Grimsby stumbling back into the doorframe, blood trickling from his lip. "Watch your tongue," Adrian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Or I will have it cut out." Grimsby touched his lip, his face turning purple with rage. "You assault me in my own building? I'll have the law on you. I am Silas Grimsby, a man of property." "Property?" Adrian repeated, tasting the word like sour wine. "You own this? Sty? I own the mill, and I own these tenements. And this woman owes me £3 for medicine and rent. If she doesn't pay, the law says I can seize assets." "The boy is an asset." Adrian reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out the pistol, though he wanted to. Instead, he pulled out a leather billfold. He extracted a crisp, white banknote. "This is a £50 note," Adrian said. Holding it up, Grimsby's eyes bulged. £50 was more than a factory worker made in 2 years. It was a fortune. "That covers the debt," Grimsby said, reaching for it greedily. "And a bit for the trouble." Adrian pulled the note back. "This buys the debt. It buys the rent for every tenant in this building for a year. And it buys your silence." Adrian stepped closer, looming over the man. "But we are not done. You threatened a child. You threatened my child." "Your?" Grimsby looked from Adrian to Leo, noting the identical dark eyes. The color drained from his face. I didn't know the lad had a father of quality. Look, take the girl, take the boy. We're square." "We are not square," Adrian said. "Mr. Moore at the mill tells me you cut corners on safety. You employ children under the legal age. You blackmail widows. That's business, Grimsby squeaked. No, Adrian said. That is over. He tossed the 50-pound note onto the dirty floorboards. Pick it up. Grimsby scrambled to his knees, his dignity gone, clutching the money. Now, Adrian said, get out. If I ever see your face in London or Manchester or anywhere in England again, I will have my solicitors dismantle your life until you are begging on the very streets you force these people to live in. Do you understand? Yes, sir, your lordship. Grimsby scrambled backward, tripping over his own cane, and fled down the stairs. The sound of his terrified footsteps faded into the rain. The room was silent. Adrian turned back to Evelyn. The rage evaporated, leaving him looking exhausted and vulnerable. Pack your things, Evelyn, he said gently. Please. Evelyn looked at the man she had run from 5 years ago. She saw the lines of pain on his face, the way his hands shook slightly after the confrontation. He had defended her. He had claimed Leo without hesitation. I don't have anything to pack, she whispered. Just Leo's bear and my sewing kit. Adrian nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He walked over to Leo, crouching down so they were eye level. He ignored the mud staining his trousers. Leo, Adrian said softly, do you like horses? Leo's eyes widened. I've seen them pulling the carts, the big ones. I have a carriage downstairs, Adrian said, with 4 white horses. Would you like to drive them with me? Leo looked at his mother. Evelyn gave a teary, tentative smile. Go on, Leo. As the boy rushed to put on his worn shoes, Adrian stood and offered his arm to his wife. Let's go home, Evelyn, he said. The war is over. She hesitated for a second, then slid her rough, scarred hand into the crook of his velvet-clad arm. Home, she echoed, though the word felt foreign and dangerous. The journey to Blackwood Hall took 3 days. They stopped at the finest inns, where Adrian ordered baths, new clothes, and hot meals. He watched Leo eat with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. The boy ate as if the food might vanish if he stopped. When the carriage finally pulled through the iron gates of Blackwood Hall, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns. Leo was pressed against the glass. Is this the king's house? Adrian chuckled, a rusty sound. No, Leo, it's your house. The carriage halted in front of the massive stone steps. The front doors swung open, and a line of servants filed out, led by Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, and Mr. Sterling, the elderly butler. They wore black armbands, a tradition Adrian had insisted on keeping even 5 years later. Adrian stepped out first, then turned to help Evelyn down. As Evelyn's foot touched the gravel, Mrs. Higgins gasped. The color drained from her face, and she swayed, clutching Mr. Sterling's arm for support. Heaven save us, Mrs. Higgins whispered. It's a spirit. No spirit, Mrs. Higgins, Adrian announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The Duchess has returned home. She was lost, and now she is found. He lifted Leo down. The servants stared at the boy, the undeniable proof of the Duke's lineage. The whispering started immediately, a hive of shock and scandal. Prepare the master suite, Adrian ordered, and the nursery, the one next to my chambers. But, Your Grace, Sterling stammered, the master suite has been sealed since her Grace's funeral. Unseal it, Adrian commanded. Burn the black drapes. Open the windows. I want light in this house. Tonight. Inside, the hall was grand and imposing, filled with portraits of ancestors who seemed to glare at Evelyn. She felt small in her new silk dress, a hastily bought garment that didn't quite fit. She clutched Leo's hand. It's too much, Adrian, she whispered as they ascended the grand staircase. They are staring at me like I'm a monster. They are staring at a miracle, Adrian corrected. That night, after Leo had been tucked into a bed larger than their entire tenement room, Adrian found Evelyn standing on the balcony of the master suite, looking out over the dark gardens. I didn't think I'd ever see this view again, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. Adrian stood behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his heat. I used to stand here every night and talk to you. I'd ask you why you left me. I'd beg you to haunt me, just so I could see you one more time. Evelyn turned to face him. The moonlight washed out the scars of poverty, making her look like the young debutante again, save for the sadness in her eyes. Adrian, about Claire, she began. You don't have to explain, Adrian said quickly. I should have told you about the financial ruin. I should have told you why I was distant. I let my pride destroy our marriage. I was jealous, Evelyn admitted, and I was young. I saw you holding her, and I didn't wait for an explanation. I just ran. And then, when I realized I was pregnant, I was so afraid you'd take the baby and lock me away in some country estate while you lived your life with Claire. I would never, Adrian vowed. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek. You are the only woman I have ever looked at, Evelyn. Even when I thought you were dead, no one else existed. He leaned in, and for the first time in 5 years, their lips met. It wasn't the passionate, desperate kiss of newlyweds. It was a slow, tentative kiss. A reintroduction, a promise. But the peace was fragile. The next morning, the peace shattered. They were in the breakfast room, Leo happily devouring a plate of sausages, when the double doors banged open. A woman swept in. She was in her 60s, dressed in severe black mourning weeds that cost more than a small village. She carried a cane not for support, but for striking things. It was Augusta, the Dowager Duchess, Adrian's mother. What is this madness? Augusta shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I receive a telegram from the vicar saying there is a woman in my son's house wearing his dead wife's face. Adrian stood up, placing a napkin on the table. Good morning, Mother. I see the news travels fast. Augusta marched up to the table. She looked at Evelyn with eyes like chips of flint. She didn't look shocked. She looked furious. You, Augusta spat. I knew you were trouble the moment Adrian married you. A flighty, emotional girl. And now, a con artist? She is not a con artist, Adrian said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register he had used with Grimsby. She is my wife. Your wife is dead, Augusta yelled. We buried her. We had a funeral. The king sent a wreath. If this creature is alive, then who is in the crypt? An empty coffin, Evelyn said, her voice steady. She stood up, facing the woman who had made her life miserable for the 2 years she had lived at Blackwood. I paid the undertaker in Dover with my jewelry to send a sealed casket. There is nothing in the Ashford crypt but rocks, Augusta gasped, clutching her pearls. Desecration! Fraud! Adrian, look at her. Look at her hands. They are the hands of a servant. She is a commoner pretending to be a lady. These hands, Adrian said, walking over and taking Evelyn's hand, lifting it to his lips, kept my son alive. They worked until they bled so the heir to this house wouldn't starve. Son? Augusta's gaze snapped to Leo. Leo stopped eating. He shrank back into his chair under the old woman's glare. A bastard, Augusta sneered, picked up from the gutter to secure your claim to the estate. He has Adrian's eyes, Evelyn shouted, her maternal instinct overriding her fear. Look at him, you bitter old woman. He is an Ashford through and through. We shall see, Augusta hissed. Society will not accept this farce, Adrian. You are the Duke. You cannot just drag a seamstress in from the slums and call her Duchess. The Crown will investigate. If she is an impostor, you will be stripped of your title for fraud. Let them investigate, Adrian said. In fact, we will invite them. We are holding a ball. Next Saturday, the Resurrection Ball. Everyone will be invited, the king, the prime minister, and all the gossips you hold so dear. You wouldn't dare, Augusta breathed. I would, Adrian said. And you, Mother, will attend, and you will curtsy to the Duchess, or you will lose your allowance and be sent to the dower house in Scotland. Augusta turned purple. She glared at Evelyn one last time. This isn't over. A woman doesn't come back from the dead without bringing hell with her. She turned and marched out. Adrian exhaled, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Evelyn. "I am sorry." "Don't be," Evelyn said, a fire lighting in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "She's right. I did bring hell with me, but this time, I'm the one holding the pitchfork." The week leading up to the ball was a frenzy. Dressmakers, milliners, and jewelers flooded Blackwood Hall. Adrian spared no expense. He wanted Evelyn to be armored in diamonds and silk. But the atmosphere was tense. The newspapers had caught wind of the story. "The Duchess returns from the grave?" the headlines screamed. "Miracle, OR, fraud?" Evelyn spent hours with tutors, relearning the etiquette she had abandoned for survival. But at night, she would wake up screaming, dreaming she was back in the mill, the sound of the looms drowning out Leo's cries. On the night of the ball, Blackwood Hall was ablaze with light. Hundreds of carriages lined the drive. The entire ton had arrived, hungry for scandal. Evelyn stood at the top of the grand staircase. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread that looked like stars. Around her neck was the Ashford sapphire, a heavy, priceless gem that hadn't been worn in decades. Adrian stood beside her, resplendent in his formal regalia. He took her hand. It was cold. "They are waiting to tear me apart," Evelyn whispered. "Let them try," Adrian said. "I am right here." They began to descend. As they came into view of the ballroom below, the chatter stopped. Silence, thick and heavy, descended on the room. 500 pairs of eyes looked up. They reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd parted, creating a wide aisle. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "Stop!" It was Lord Holloway, a cousin of the family, and a man who would have been third in line for the dukedom if Adrian and Leo died. He stepped forward, his face flushed with drink and indignation. "This is a mockery," Holloway shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Evelyn. "That is not Evelyn Penhaligon." Evelyn had a scar on her left shoulder from a riding accident when she was 12. "This woman is a fraud!" A gasp rippled through the room. The crowd leaned in. This was the drama they had come for. Evelyn froze. She did have a scar, but she had been wearing high-necked rags for 5 years. Adrian stepped forward, his face darkening. "Holloway, if you do not step back, show us," Holloway demanded. "If she is the Duchess, let her prove it. Or are you afraid we'll see the truth?" The Dowager Duchess Augusta stood in the corner, a triumphant smirk on her face. She had clearly fed Holloway this information. Evelyn looked at the sea of hostile faces. She looked at Adrian, who was ready to fight them all for her. She let go of Adrian's hand. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up to the left shoulder of her gown. The dress was designed with a heavy strap. With a steady hand, she unhooked the clasp and let the velvet slide down her arm, exposing her pale shoulder to the entire room. There, white against her skin, was the jagged, faint line of an old scar. But there was something else. Just below the scar, angry and red, was a burn mark. The brand of the spinning wheel from the mill, where a hot piston had grazed her a year ago. "There is your scar, my lord." Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and strong. "And here," she touched the burn, "here is the mark of the life I lived while you all drank champagne and forgot my name. I am Evelyn Penhaligon. I am the Duchess of Ashford. And I have survived things that would shatter a soft man like you in a day." She pulled her strap back up, silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then, a slow clapping started. It was Lady Claire Vance, the other woman. She walked through the crowd, tears in her eyes, clapping her hands. "Welcome home, cousin," Claire said, curtsying low. One by one, the others followed. The sheer audacity, the undeniable proof, and the strength of her performance swayed the mob. The clapping grew until it was a thunderous ovation. Adrian looked at his wife with awe. She wasn't just the girl he had married. She was a queen. But as the music started and Adrian swept Evelyn onto the dance floor, a footman hurried through the crowd. He looked pale. He weaved through the dancers and whispered something into Adrian's ear. Adrian stopped dancing. His face went gray. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, gripping his arm. "It's Leo," Adrian whispered, his voice strangled with panic. "What about him?" "He's upstairs with the nanny. The nanny was found unconscious in the hallway," Adrian said, looking toward the dark exit of the ballroom. "Evelyn, Leo is gone." The music in the ballroom had curdled into a grotesque mockery of joy. The orchestra, unaware of the tragedy unfolding, continued to play a lively waltz, but Adrian and Evelyn were already sprinting up the grand staircase, leaving a trail of confused gasps in their wake. They burst into the nursery. The room was in chaos. The heavy oak window frame had been pried open, letting in the cold night wind and a swirl of dead leaves. The nanny, a stout woman named Mrs. Gable, lay slumped against the crib, a dark bruise blooming on her temple. But the bed, the small, warm bed where Leo had been sleeping, was empty. Evelyn let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the keening wail of a wounded animal. She collapsed against the empty mattress, clutching the stuffed bear that had been left behind. "They took him! Adrian, they took him!" Adrian didn't scream. He went cold. A deadly, terrifying calm settled over him, the ice of a man who has nothing left to lose. He moved to the open window. The mud on the sill was fresh. He saw the imprint of a heavy boot. "Not they," Adrian said, his voice dropping an octave. "Him." He pointed to a scrap of fabric, caught on a splinter of the wood. It was coarse, greasy wool, the kind worn by men who worked the factories of Manchester. "Grimsby," Evelyn whispered, the blood draining from her face. "But how? He's in Manchester. He's hundreds of miles away." "He followed us," Adrian said, turning from the window. "Or he was invited." Adrian marched out of the nursery, his boots thudding heavily on the carpet. He didn't head for the front door. He headed for the Dowager Duchess's chambers. He kicked the door open without knocking. Augusta was sitting by her fire, sipping brandy, looking smug. "Well, that was quite a theatrical exit, Adrian. Has the little impostor finally confessed?" Adrian crossed the room in 2 strides and kicked the small table, sending the crystal decanter smashing into the fireplace. The flames roared up, illuminating his face. It was a mask of fury. "Where is he?" Adrian roared. Augusta flinched, genuinely startled. "Who? What are you talking about?" "Leo is gone," Adrian snarled. "Taken from his bed. And I know you hate him. I know you want him gone. Tell me where you sent him, and I might let you live in exile instead of prison." Augusta stood up, her face pale. I didn't send him anywhere. I wanted him disinherited, Adrian, not kidnapped. I am an Ashford. We do not kidnap children." Adrian stared at her. He saw the fear in her eyes. It was genuine. She was cruel, yes, but she wasn't a criminal mastermind. "If not you," Adrian hissed, "then who let Grimsby in? Who opened the gates?" "Grimsby?" Augusta looked confused. "That horrid man from the slums? I saw him talking to Lord Halloway in the garden earlier. I thought Halloway was just paying off a gambling debt." "Halloway," Adrian realized. Of course. It made perfect sense. Halloway was next in line for the title. With Leo gone and Evelyn discredited, the fortune would eventually revert to him. He had hired Grimsby, a man with a grudge and no morals, to do the dirty work. "Get the horses," Adrian shouted to the footman trembling in the hallway, "and get my gun." Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She had ripped the long, restrictive train off her velvet gown. She had tied her hair back with a strip of silk. She held a heavy iron fireplace poker in her hand. "I'm coming with you," she said. "Evelyn, it's dangerous." Adrian started. "He is my son," she cut him off. "I fought starvation, freezing winters, and sickness for him. Do you think I'm afraid of a man like Grimsby?" Adrian looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He nodded. "Ride with me." They stormed out into the night. The rain had started again, a torrential downpour that turned the world into mud and shadow. The tracks of a carriage were visible in the soft gravel of the driveway. leading away from the main road and toward the old, abandoned coastal path. "Where are they going?" Evelyn screamed over the wind as they galloped through the dark woods. "That road leads nowhere. It just goes to the old lighthouse ruins." "The cliffs," Adrian shouted back, his heart stopping. "He's not taking him for ransom, Evelyn. Holloway doesn't want money. He wants the heir removed." The realization hit them both like a physical blow. They kicked their horses faster, flying blindly through the storm, guided only by the flashes of lightning that illuminated the treacherous path ahead. Ahead of them, looming against the stormy sky, stood the jagged silhouette of the ruined lighthouse, perched precariously on the edge of the white cliffs. And there, flickering in the darkness, was a single lantern. The path to the old lighthouse was not a road. It was a scar cut into the chalk of the cliffs. The sauce. Storm had turned the ground into a treacherous slurry of mud and loose slate, and the horses fought for every step, their hooves slipping dangerously close to the drop-off. To their left, the English Channel churned in a violent, black rage, the waves smashing against the cliff face with a sound like cannon fire. Adrian didn't feel the freezing rain soaking through his coat. He didn't feel the rains digging into his gloved hands. He felt only a singular, blinding terror. Every second that ticked by was a second closer to losing the only thing that made his resurrection worthwhile. "There!" Evelyn screamed, her voice barely audible over the gale. Ahead, the skeleton of the abandoned lighthouse pierced the stormy sky. It was a jagged, broken tower of stone, long since gutted by fire and neglect. And there, flickering like a dying star at its base, was the yellow glow of a lantern. They abandoned the horses 50 yards out, sliding off the saddles into the muck. Adrian drew his pistol, the cold steel heavy and slick with rain. Evelyn gripped the iron fireplace poker she had taken from the nursery, her knuckles white, her eyes dark with a ferocity that would have terrified the generals of the king's army. They ran. As they crested the final rise, the scene revealed itself in a flash of lightning that illuminated the horror in stark blue-white clarity. Silas Grimsby stood on a precipice of rock that jutted out over the abyss. The wind whipped his greasy coat around his legs. In his left hand, he held the lantern. In his right, he held Leo. The boy was dangling by the back of his nightshirt, his small, bare feet kicking helplessly at the empty air, hundreds of feet above the crushing waves. Leo was sobbing, but the sound was snatched away by the wind before it could reach them. "Stop!" Adrian roared, the sound tearing from his throat. He raised the pistol, leveling it at Grimsby's chest. Grimsby spun around. His face was a mask of lunacy, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his teeth bared in a rictus of hate. He didn't look afraid of the gun. He looked delighted. "Your Grace!" Grimsby bellowed, his voice cracking. "I was wondering if you had the stomach to come yourself, or if you'd send another lawyer to do your dirty work." "Put him down, Grimsby," Adrian commanded, stepping closer. The mud sucked at his boots. "Put the boy down, and you walk away. I swear it." "Walk away?" Grimsby let out a screeching, manic laugh. He shook Leo, making the boy scream. "Walk away to what? To the gutter? You ruin me, Penhaligon. You and that witch beside you. My mill is closed. My creditors have taken the house. Even the rats won't share a crumb with Silas Grimsby now." "You did that to yourself," Evelyn shouted, stepping up beside Adrian. She didn't cower. She stood tall, the wind whipping her wet hair across her face. "You squeezed the life out of your workers. You threatened widows. You are reaping what you sowed." "I was a businessman," Grimsby spat back, inching dangerously closer to the crumbling edge. "And now? Now I am nothing. But Lord Holloway, a true gentleman, he offered me a ticket out. A new life in America. All I had to do was remove the obstacle." He lifted Leo higher. The fabric of the nightshirt strained. "Don't you dare," Adrian whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he couldn't shoot. The wind was gusting erratically. At this distance, a bullet could easily miss and hit Leo. Or worse, if he killed Grimsby instantly, the man's hand would open, or his body would fall backward, taking the boy down into the darkness with him. Adrian realized with a sickening jolt that he was powerless. All his money, his title, his influence, it meant nothing here on this rock. Grimsby saw the hesitation. He smirked. "What's the matter, Duke? Can't pull the trigger? You know what happens if you do. Gravity is a harsh mistress." "Take me," Evelyn pleaded, dropping the poker and falling to her knees in the mud. The surrender was immediate and total. "Please, Silas, I'm the one you hate. I'm the one who embarrassed you. Let Leo go. He's just a child. Take me instead. Push me over. I won't fight you." Grimsby looked at her, considering it. For a moment, the cruelty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of temptation. But then he looked back at Adrian, and the hatred hardened. "You? You're worthless trash, Mary," Grimsby sneered, using her seamstress name like a curse. "Killing you brings me no pleasure. But him—" He gestured to Adrian with his head. "Breaking him? Watching the high and mighty Duke of Ashford fall to his knees and weep like a beggar? That is worth more than gold." He leaned out further. "Say goodbye to your bastard, your grace." Adrian froze. Time seemed to suspend. He saw Leo's terrified eyes, his own eyes. Looking back at him, he saw the end of his world. But Evelyn wasn't looking at Adrian. She was staring intently at her son. Her mind was racing back to the cold, loud days in the Manchester mill. The games they played to survive. The way they moved heavy bundles of cotton. The physics of weight and resistance. "Leo!" Evelyn screamed, her voice piercing the wind with a clarity that snapped the boy's attention to her. "The flour sack! Do you remember? The flour sack!" Grimsby looked confused. "What?" Leo blinked. Behind the terror, a spark of recognition lit up. It was a game they had played 100 times. "Be heavy, be deadweight, drop. Now, Leo, drop!" The boy didn't hesitate. He stopped struggling. He stopped trying to pull himself up. In an instant, he went completely limp, exhaling all his air, dropping his center of gravity with the sudden, jarring force of a dead body. The sudden shift in physics caught Grimsby completely off guard. He had been bracing against a struggling, writhing child. When Leo became a sudden, heavy, dead weight, the wet wool of the nightshirt slicked through Grimsby's greasy, cold fingers like oil. Leo slipped. But he didn't fly out over the cliff. Because he had gone limp, he dropped straight down, like a stone, hitting the muddy shelf of rock right at Grimsby's feet. "You little devil!" Grimsby roared, stumbling as the weight vanished. He lunged down, his hands clawing at the mud to grab the boy again. Bang! The shot echoed like a thunderclap, louder than the storm. Adrian hadn't missed. He hadn't aimed for the head or the heart. He aimed for the leg. The bullet shattered Grimsby's right kneecap. The large man shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure agony. His leg buckled beneath him instantly. He collapsed, twisting as he fell, landing hard on the slippery, moss-covered edge of the cliff. "My leg! You shot my leg!" Grimsby howled, clutching the ruin of his knee. Adrian was already running, sliding through the mud, holster forgotten. But Evelyn was faster. She didn't run to comfort her son. Not yet. She ran past Leo, scooping up the iron poker from the mud as she moved. She didn't stop until she was standing over Grimsby. Grimsby lay on his back, his upper body half hanging over the precipice. He clawed at the wet stone, trying to pull himself up, his face gray with shock and pain. He looked up and saw Evelyn towering over him. She didn't look like a duchess. She looked like an avenging angel carved from granite. "Help me," Grimsby begged, reaching a bloody hand toward the hem of her dress. "Pull me up! Mary, please! I'll go to prison! I'll do anything!" Evelyn looked down at the hand that had threatened to drop her son into the sea. She looked at the man who had made her live in squalor, who had threatened to sell her child to an orphanage for £3. "The Duchess is dead," Evelyn whispered, her voice cold as the grave. "And Mary doesn't work for you anymore." She raised the iron poker. She didn't strike his head. She swung the heavy iron bar down, hard, onto the fingers clutching the edge of the cliff. Crack! Grimsby screamed, a sound that tore the night apart. His grip shattered. The pain was absolute. Instinctively, he recoiled, pulling his hand back to his chest. It was the final mistake. Without his anchor, gravity took him. He slid backward, his eyes locking with Evelyn's for one final, terrified second. "No!" he cried out. And then he was gone. There was no sound of impact, just the roar of the ocean swallowing him whole. Silence rushed back into the space where the violence had been. Adrian reached the ledge a second later. He didn't look over the edge. He grabbed Leo, hauling the boy out of the mud and into his chest, burying his face in the child's wet hair. "I have you," Adrian sobbed, his aristocratic reserve completely shattered. "I have you, Leo. I have you." Leo clung to his father's neck, shivering violently, but alive. Evelyn dropped the poker. It clattered against the stone. She stood swaying on the edge of the cliff, staring into the dark abyss where her tormentor had vanished. She took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the salt air. It tasted like freedom. She turned around. Adrian was on his knees in the mud, rocking Leo back and forth. He looked up at her, his face streaked with rain and tears, his eyes filled with a worshipful awe. "Evelyn," he choked out. She walked over to them, her legs finally trembling as the adrenaline crashed. She collapsed into the mud beside them, wrapping her arms around both her husband and her son. "He's gone," Evelyn whispered, pressing her forehead against Adrian's. "It's really over." Adrian kissed the rain from her face, his hands shaking as he held her. "You saved him. You saved us all." The storm raged on around them, but in that small, huddled circle on the edge of the world, there was only warmth. They stayed there for a long time, the Duke, the Seamstress, and the boy, binding themselves together with a knot that no law, no scandal, and no villain could ever untie again. The nightmare was over. The dawn was coming. The story of the Duke and the Seamstress reminds us that true nobility isn't found in bloodlines or titles, but in the strength of the human spirit. Evelyn survived the crushing weight of poverty to protect her son, and Adrian overcame his own pride to fight for the family he thought he'd lost. Their reunion wasn't just luck. It was earned through suffering, forgiveness, and an unbreakable bond. The villains, Grimsby and Holloway, met their end through their own greed, proving that karma always collects its debts in the end. If this story moved you, or if you cheered when Evelyn finally stood up to her oppressors, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more powerful stories like this one. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a dramatic twist, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode. See you in the next story.